Good morning. Today we're going to take a trip out to an area known as the Chloride Cliffs. It's an area that's about 100 miles north and west of Las Vegas. It was in the southern Bullfrog Mining District, just across the border into California from Nevada, and mostly located in the Death Valley National Monument. I'm going to take a trip out there today, do a little bit of research, and make some videos. Got the coffee and ready to go make the road trip. Let's go have some fun. Chloride Cliff is a term which has been applied to a geographic area. It's a series of mines, towns, and mining districts. For the purposes of this video, Chloride Cliff will be used in its geographic sense to define an area 4 square miles. The entire Chloride Cliff area, it's cluttered with old shafts, adits, and dumps, as well as collapsed buildings and dugouts and several rather modern shacks. Some of these old mines indicate that the activities were carried out over a period of several years, but most point to efforts lasting little more than several months. This area starts at the cliff itself on the south side, where one may stand on an old mine dump and gaze down upon a spectacular view of Death Valley some 5,000 feet below. This is the oldest mining area in the entire Death Valley National Monument. It was discovered in August 14, 1871 by A.J. Franklin. He was a civil engineer employed by the U.S. government to assist in surveying the Nevada-California state line. Although the stories vary, some say he picked up a rock to kill a rattlesnake and found ore. Franklin somehow found what he thought was a vein of chloride silver. He immediately staked out 7 claims, called it the Franklin Group, and the following October formed the Chloride Cliff Mining Company. By July of 1873, Franklin employed 7 miners. He dug a shaft that was sunk down to about 75 feet and had nearly 100 tons of ore on the dump and ready for shipment. Transportation, however, was a definite problem in this area. The mine was dependent upon San Bernardino, 180 miles away, for food and supplies. Pack trains arrived with supplies about every 3 months. As these mule teams traveled back and forth, they slowly identified the best route between Death Valley and San Bernardino. But even with a new road to follow, the great expenses of packing in supplies and hauling out the ore made Chloride Cliff mining area unprofitable. While A.J. Franklin was trying to make up his mind and try to find investors in the area, the Great Panama boom started on the west side of Death Valley, which made his small mine relatively unattractive to those who had capital to invest. After nearly 2 years of operation, the Chloride Cliff mine shut down. However, A.J. Franklin never did completely abandon his mine. Every year, he traveled back across the desert to perform the annual assessment work on the Chloride Cliff mine until his death in 1904. Then his son, George Franklin, followed in his footsteps and kept the claim active until the bullfrog boom hit southwest Nevada. George Franklin held an active and valid claim, which could once more be profitable as transportation and supplies became cheaper through connections at the new boomtown of Rhyolite. With the exception of the Franklins, the Chloride Cliff area was virtually deserted between 1873 and 1903. Then in 1904, the original Bullfrog Mine was discovered in southern Nevada, and the Bullfrog Mining District was created, and newfound interest in the Chloride Cliff area began. All the mining activity naturally called for a supporting town site, or at least a very small mining camp, and Chloride City was born in 1905. The little town was placed in a very picturesque spot for those who could stand the winds which constantly whipped across the Funeral Mountains and brought snow and blizzards during the winter months. By this time, George Franklin had plenty of company in the area. In the immediate vicinity of his mine, there was the Mucho Oro Mining Company, the Bullfrog Cliff Mining Company, and the Death Valley Mining and Milling Company. They all appeared within the next several months. The three companies, along with Franklin's mine, soon dominated the best ground in the Chloride Cliffs area. And they also squeezed out smaller companies and prospectors. During the first few months of 1906, developments proceeded at the Chloride Cliff mines. The Bullfrog Cliff Mine reported that it had enough ore in sight to support a small mill. A gentleman by the name of J. Irving Crawwell, who was the principal owner of the Chloride Cliff Mine, went to San Francisco to conduct mill tests and arrange for financing. The Death Valley Mining and Milling Company continued to drive its two tunnels and reported in February that it had 50 tons of $50 ore on the dumps and 100 tons of lower grade. The company announced that it would send its ore to the new custom mill at Gold Center for processing when the mill was completed. While awaiting that time, the mine shut down temporarily. In April of 1906, the Death Valley Company began mill tests upon its ore to determine the best method of treatment and let a contractor have its tunnel extended another 350 feet. Then the San Francisco earthquake and fire occurred, and the Chloride Cliff mines cut back on operations as everyone waited to see what effect the destruction of the West Coast financial center would have upon the mines. Very little work was done through April and May, and in June the Death Valley Mining and Company owned the only Chloride Cliff mine which was able to resume operations. The San Francisco disaster seemed to be the last straw for George Franklin. In July, he finally gave up and sold the mine, which had been in his family since 1871, to a group of Pittsburgh investors for a reported $150,000. The new owners, however, made no immediate moves to reactivate the mine. The Death Valley Mining and Milling Company, however, forged ahead with its development plans and work and began considering a mill of its own, since it was becoming more evident that the Gold Center mill would never be completed. The company put out large advertisements in Rhyolite newspapers and really gathered no interest. The post-San Francisco climate was not conducive to investment in a small and unproven mine. The advertisements proved futile, and the Death Valley Company abruptly shut down operations in late July. All of the Chloride Cliff mines were now idle. The mines of the Chloride Cliff went through a period of hiatus during the last half of 1906 and each year up to 1909, while the rest of the Bullfrog District and the South Bullfrog District were experiencing their biggest boom years. The Chloride Cliffs remain idle. The only activity that happened during this period of time is that the several owners seem to consolidate all of the properties into one ownership. The manager and the mining engineer that ran all of this conglomeration, his name was J. Irving Crawwell. He was a former president of the Bullfrog Cliff Mine operation. And then December of 1909, after an interval of over 3 years of laying dormant, serious work began on the property, the Chloride Cliff Mining Company. Development work began that month, and by the first week of 1910, the company was beginning to sack ore for shipment. During February, the company announced definite intentions to build a small mill. During February, the company began improving the road between its estate and Rhyolite in order to facilitate the delivery of mill machinery. Water for the mines and miners was packed in from Keene Springs, some 3 miles to the north, and wood for the barren Chloride Cliff region was brought in from 10 miles away. This is one of the methods by which they hauled water around the Chloride Cliff area. Certainly not very efficient. As near as we can tell, King Springs precedes and predates the Bullfrog Mining District. One person by the name of Eugene Lander had a claim to the springs as early as 1878, presumably to sell its water to the Franklins, who were working on their Chloride Cliff Mine. But Keene Springs saw its peak of activity during the Bullfrog mining boom. King Springs never became anything more than just a little tent city. It lay dormant for many, many years. It was only active when the nearby mines were needing water, and they had to actually truck it from the springs back up to the Chloride Cliff area, which was not efficient. I arrived at the Chloride Cliff area and found numerous buildings and old dilapidated wooden structures. Didn't see too much in the way of concrete or rock structures, but wanted to have you take a look around with me. Let's go explore. I plan these trips ahead of time. Never really know what you're going to run across. A little bit disappointed because there's not a whole lot of equipment here, but then again, as I understand, it just didn't have much activity and was never very productive here. So that's why there's not just a whole lot of structures to see, but gets us out on a beautiful day in the wintertime. And enjoy the walk around. There's some evidence behind me that shows there was at least some mining activity. This place never really developed anything that produced a lot of silver. That's the ore that was discovered here. Discovered in the late 1800s. A bunch of claims were staked and remained kind of dormant until the early 1900s when there was a mining attempt in earnest to be made. A couple of wooden structures and mostly residential structures and walled tents that existed out here. Didn't find any evidence of rock foundations, and from what I'm reading, there was never any businesses established here. Still kind of nice to walk around and check this place out, called Chloride Cliffs. And this particular location is called Chloride City, and it never became a city. Nice and peaceful and quiet out here. You can imagine during the operation, most of these mining operations were very noisy. The site that we're walking around right now is known as the Mercury Plant. As I understand and from what I read, this was constructed in the late 1930s. Although erosion makes it difficult to judge the amount of tailings around the mill, would seem to indicate a life of several months before the complex was destroyed by fire. You can see some old bins here. Part of the operation. Looks like some kind of a conveyor belt driven piece of equipment right there. Not much to look at, but a beautiful day, a little breezy, but here's some of those wood structures I was speaking of. I think most of these were residences. From what I have read, there was really no businesses ever established here in this so-called Chloride City. Only makes sense that all this stuff collapses in this environment. Things I read up on this James Mckay gravesite is nobody really knows who it was or what role they played here in this Chloride Cliff area. Old structure over there. You can see they used to use rock and soil for part of their insulation and maybe keeping the tin roof from flying away as well. Interesting setup here. This little wood structure out front of this, what appears to be a mine entry. Probably was an old bed frame right there. You can see the Park Services have that blocked off back there. There's that metal structure from the view of inside the mine entry. As I conclude my trip to the Chloride Cliffs area, I head back out towards the Daylight Pass, which will ultimately end up in Beatty, Nevada. When I reached the bottom of this canyon, there's a place known as Monarch Canyon, so I decided to take a trip down there. I understand that there's some great mine ruins and a mill ruins there that we can take a look at. hike is labeled as easy in some records. It's about 1.2 miles round trip. But the outstanding mill ruins was well worth it. There's not a whole lot of written history about this particular mill site and mine up above, other than it was discovered by a person by the name of A.K. Ishmael, and they referred to it as the Indian Group of Claims. In May of 1910, Ishmael had announced that they had purchased a small two-stamp Nissan mill, which they had installed by August of that same year. According to newspaper records, the mill was working from at least August 27 through October 15 in 1910, and was said to be getting good results, producing several small bars of bullion before work was suspended. The mill was used again in 1911 by the Hartford, Montana Company. The last known operations of this particular mine site and the mill was reported by the Inyo Independent newspaper in 1912. Well, this concludes my trip to Chloride Cliffs area and the surrounding areas known as Keene Springs and Monarch Mine. Hope you enjoyed this video as much as I did making it. Please hit the subscribe button and like button. It helps out a lot. Thanks. Hope you enjoy.